Speaker for tonight.
Well, I wasn't going to break my anonymity, but it's too late now. Chuck, and I'm an alcoholic. I'm from Minneapolis, M, so I won't break my city's anonymity. I told Faye that I went and took a nap during her talk today, so I've given her permission to leave at any time to take her nap. I'm sober today because of the grace of God and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I had my last drink on February the 16th, 1970. And I think the highlight for me as I was watching this crowd tonight was to see Bob, with 49 years, sign a book for a guy with a couple of weeks. And I come from a city that passed it on last summer into the 21st century, and a lot of you came to that. And some of us are still talking about it. It was so much fun. But I'm here to tell you my story, how I found the miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous. I have a home group, just to let you know that I'm not a floater. There's a guy I sponsor, he's a retired teacher. And whenever he's invited out to give a talk, why, he always mentions that he has a home group so that you know he's not a floater. And there's nothing wrong with going to a lot of meetings, but you got to have your hooks in one of them anyway, you know. That's where you're going to get the help and the fellowship and the sponsorship and the service and the commitment and all the things that are going to help you live your life one day at a time. But my home group is called Tradition 5. We meet on Monday nights in Golden Valley. I invite all of you to come sometime. You can call our intergroup office. We answer it live 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and most all the volunteers that answer the phone can give you the directions to that meeting. And I've been a member of that meeting for 15 years. The meeting's only 15 years old, but I didn't start the meeting. The school teacher I just referred to, I sponsor, started it. And he left the group we were going to and wanted to know if I was interested. And I said, no, I wasn't. I said, you go start it, and maybe I'll come over and visit you. And I went over and visited about a month after it got going, and I kind of liked it. There was only about 8 people there. And now we have about 175 there every Monday night. I don't know what we'd do with all of them, but it seems to work pretty good. And I hope your group works pretty good, too. That's kind of why we're here, isn't it? Because our group is working good. I was born on December the 25th, 1939. Now, I know everybody in this room was born. I mean, that's not a big deal, right? For me, it was a big deal. And I'll tell you why it was a big deal. Just 9 months before, Dr. Bob and Bill brought that book out called Alcoholics Anonymous. 9 months before. And I have a sneaking suspicion that God came down to Bill and Bob and says, you better get one out quick because we've got a humdinger coming up. My mother describes that Christmas morning when 2 nurses, actually 3, one carrying me and one each carrying a candle, singing Silent Night going down the corridor of that hospital in Sioux City, Iowa. And I brought great joy to my family that day. And on the 26th of December, it started going downhill from there. I didn't know it was going to go downhill, but it just did. I heard Mildred, I was listening to a bunch of tapes going down to Omaha last week, and I heard Mildred talking about the days when she was being raised. And those were the days when children were to be seen and not heard. My dad was good at things like, shut up, Charlie. I was Charlie most of my life until I went into the military service and I became Chuck. And some girl that I went out with named me that, and I seemed to like it, and I've been Chuck ever since. But I was Charlie when I was growing up. I would go in and out of a lot of different schools and social workers in my early days. I had a learning disability, still have. Didn't recognize it, didn't admit to it for a long time. Sometimes I read words backwards and upside down. I have a short attention span. Today, when kids go to school, they have ways to deal with that. But when I went to school, I was just stupid. And when I took a drink of whiskey, I wasn't stupid anymore. It was just that simple. I remember one little incident at our house. I came home and my mother was drunk and my dad was screaming and hollering, and I went down in our basement and broke up all our fruit jars with a baseball bat, as my mother was throwing plates at my dad when he ran out of the house. So I was brought up with a lot of love and service. Now, I'm not blaming my parents for my alcoholism. The real reason that I became an alcoholic is because I drank alcohol, not because my mother put me on a potty chair backwards, or they threw plates at each other, you know. But that was the atmosphere in which I grew up in. I remember when I was about 11 or 12, I couldn't bring my friends home from school anymore because I didn't know what kind of condition my mom might be in. Sometimes she said bad words, four-letter words in front of my friends. Other times she'd just be passed out on the floor. And I had a young brother, and I used to think that he didn't know what was going on, but I guess he did. He's not an alcoholic. But later on in life, I discovered that he didn't have it so good either, and I always thought he was the one that had it made. And one time I thought, you know, if I could get rid of that beer and whiskey my mom's drinking upstairs, maybe she wouldn't be like that anymore. So I was pouring the beer and whiskey down the drain in our basement, and I took a little smell of it, and I liked what it smelled like, and I took a little taste of it, and I liked what it tasted like. And all of a sudden, I didn't have a drunken mom upstairs on the living room floor anymore. And I'm going to tell you about my first drink and my last drink, and everything else about my story. I'm not going to talk much about drinking because I never had any problems while I was drinking. All my problems happened between drinks, and I'm going to talk about some of those. But I was just fine as long as I was drinking, but I never had any problems until I was stopped for a while, you know. I gave a talk not long ago, and a guy came up and says, well, gee, you didn't talk much about your drinking. I says, well, I had a great time drinking. I never had any problems when I was drinking. It was always in between the drinks that I had all the problems. So that was my first drink. Yeah, and I know from that first time that I knew that the next time I could drink again, that things were going to be better, that things were going to be just perfect. And pretty soon I started visiting orphanages and psych wards, and I was only 13, 14 years old, and school counselors, and I'd go around to different schools, and they'd put me in this one for a while. Then they'd put me behind, and if I would have continued that merry-go-round, I'm 61 years old, and I'd still be in about the 7th grade if I kept doing that. And that's the way I got settled with life, was to drink that alcohol. And I knew that if I could keep a drink in me, why, my world somehow was rosy again, you know, it was okay. It just occurred to me as I was talking about that little early story, as I kind of forgot to thank the committee for asking Bob Azans to be your sponsor this weekend. They didn't ask me. Bob did. He's got a 40th high school reunion. He cheated through school. That's how he graduated. And so I wanted to bring that up and thank the committee for accepting me as their substitute speaker. Ken picked me up at the airport, and we've had a good visit. But I wanted to throw that in about Bob, because Bob and I are pretty much alike. He is my sponsor, has been for about the last 9 years. And I appreciate Kim for giving me a call and Ken for picking me up. I forgot those little things that you do when you first get up here. But I went on to live my life like everything was just fine. And by the time I was 14, I became fairly acquainted with the juvenile detention and juvenile authorities in my hometown, which was Sioux City, Iowa. And the head of detectives for the juvenile division became somewhat of a friend of mine. He occasionally would put me in jail, but in between times he was my friend. He'd put me in a patrol car and buy me a malted milk, and I'd ride around with him a little bit. And then other times he'd say, well, your mom's been looking for you for the last 4 days. He said, I'm going to have to take you in. But before long, he had a friend that worked at Boys Town, Nebraska, and he was able to get me an appointment to go down there and see them, and that's where I ended up at age 15 in Boys Town. That was 1955. And I look back on that, or at that time, I was so ashamed of going to a place like Boys Town, Nebraska, but today I look back on it, and it was probably the only period of my life, and I was there a couple of years, that I had any kind of a normal childhood, in a sense. And that was in the days when they only had boys there. Today they have girls. was at an AA do down in Omaha a few years ago, and I took some friends of mine out to Boys Town to show them around, and we went through the Hall of History, which is like their big archives display there, and there was some young high school students, boys and girls, and I says, "Are you a resident of the home?" And this little girl had a name tag on named Joni, and she says, "Yeah." She says, "I am." And I says, "Well, when I was here, they only have boys. They only had boys here." And she says, "Well, they've improved it since you were here." So, and that story reminds me of the fact that we kind of had the same situation in Alcoholics Anonymous. We had all these guys here in the beginning, and in the beginning they didn't want to let women in the meetings, and finally that changed around a little bit. And I'll tell you what, AA's improved considerably since women have come into our fellowship as well. And I was raised by an alcoholic woman, and I know the fear and the hopelessness and the shame that you have inside of yourselves, because my mother told me these things. And so it's very difficult, but my God, I'm glad you're here. I left Boys Town, went home for a little while, and then went off to the military service to seek my fortune. And while I was there, I got in trouble with drinking and tried to commit suicide. They didn't like that so well. They kind of frown on it. I ended up in the Bay Psych Ward, and they discharged me, and I was there, I don't know, 18 or 19 months. But it seemed like every place I went, Charlie wasn't welcome too long after he arrived. And that was before I was 21 years old. All these things had happened. I went back home one more time, and I thought, you know what I want to be is I want to be a big shot. And the problem is when you're being a big shot, it costs money to be a big shot. And I spent money that wasn't mine, and all of a sudden I was in the county jail getting ready for trial. And I was sentenced to a year and a day in the state penitentiary. And here I was, 21 years old, convicted felon. They gave me probation, living on Skid Row. And I thought my life was going down the tubes. One day I went up to my probation officer and I said, my parents now live down in Missouri, and my dad and mother invited me to come down there and live with them until I can get kind of straightened out a little bit. And do you mind if I leave? And he was pretty okay with me getting out of town. So was a few other people that lived there. Some years later, I went back and did as an AA member, kind of on a panel of alcoholism in industry, and made my amends to that city, and met the mayor and a few of the people in the city council and some industry people, and that was the way I could make my amends. One of the ladies in the room asked me, how do you know when an alcoholic is lying? I said, well, just as soon as they open their mouth. It's a pretty good sign. And she said, well, I've had a lot of alcoholics working for me, and they have never worked out except the ones that got into AA. So I was glad to be able to do that. That was about 1980 or 81. And I called my mother one day. I happened to catch her on a day that she was sober, and I packed my Camel soup bag and soup box and put my jeans and my shaving gear in there, and I went off to Kansas City to seek my fortune. And when I got down there, I was able to, I always did pretty good at lying on applications. My dad used to say something like, you know, Charlie, you've had more good jobs than most people have in a lifetime, but somehow something always happens. And that was always kind of my problem. In between drinks, something would happen and I'd lose a job, or I'd steal some money, or I'd drink too much. But this time I knew it was going to be different, that if I could meet that right person, you know, settle down, get a white picket fence. And I was I wasn't really managing, I was an assistant manager of a restaurant in a shopping mall for a company out of Chicago. And all the people that worked in the bank in that mall would come in there at lunchtime, and there's this one particularly nice lady that come in there, about my age, that worked at the bank. And I found out she had $2,000 in that bank, and I began to fall in love. Now, based on what people are laughing about, it looks like I'm not the only one that's ever happened to, you know. So we decided to get married. This was in Independence, Missouri. We just lived a few blocks from Harry Truman, and I thought it was a pretty big deal to see him heading down towards the library. He would walk for a block or two, Secret Service behind him, and then they'd put him in the car and run him the rest of the way. And I'd go out and get the paper and say, good morning, Mr. President. He'd throw his hat up. And the problem that I found in this marriage, and I didn't realize it when we got married, is that her mother and father were very narrow-minded. And I don't know if anybody has ever had an in-law that was narrow-minded, but these were to the extreme. They thought I drank too much. Now, I don't know where they got that idea, but somehow they got it, and things were I was starting to sweat bullets a little bit. So what I did was I got a nervous condition, and I went into the psych center in the local hospital to see what they could do about that, and it turned out that they thought I was crazy. And for me, that was good news. Because, see, I'd much rather be crazy than be an alcoholic. Now, I don't want to put down mental health help, because there's a lot of us in AA and outside of AA that need mental health help, and that's a good thing. And if we're sober and going to meetings and working with a sponsor, we can do it on an honest basis, you know. But I was a bad actor in that marriage. I told you that I was born on Christmas, so Christmas was always supposed to be special. And that last Christmas, her and I were together. I was supposed to come home around 5 o'clock, and we were going to go have dinner with her parents and go to a midnight service someplace. Problem is, I had to stop off and see these old friends of mine, you know, the ones you never know their names. And you had to buy around, and then it was their time to buy around. And I didn't get home till 9:30, 10 o'clock, and I guess I was drunk. When I woke up on Christmas morning, why, her eyes were black and her lip was cracked, and I'd hit her. And that's when the nervous condition really kicked in. A few weeks later, I was sitting in a psych ward in downtown Kansas City. And during that time, she came up and asked me for a divorce, and that was a good thing. I finally left that hospital. My dad said to me, he says, you know, Charlie, he says, you are a free spirit. You have no business getting married. And I was out of there a couple of months, divorced a couple of months, and I was out being a free spirit one day, and I ran into a lady with a beautiful blue convertible. And I had a brand new red convertible. And she was a widow, had a housekeeper at home that looked after her children and fixed all the meals except on Saturdays and Sundays. She had more than $2,000 in the bank. And I began to fall in love. Her husband had been killed in a pretty serious automobile accident and had left her pretty well off. She worked for a major law firm in downtown Kansas City. And so I thought I had arrived, you know. One drink after another, I was becoming more famous and seeing more people. What a wonderful thing. Problem was, I got my nervous condition back. And this time they sent me to the state hospital in St. Joe, Missouri. And I didn't know this at the time they sent me there, but it was for an indefinite period. Indefinite means it could be for a long time, or maybe it could be forever. I don't know, but I was there a long time. But up there is I learned how to do true fellowship, and that's was kind of a training ground for getting to this fellowship. They don't have a lot of extra help in these state-run hospitals, so when it's your turn to get a shock treatment or somebody else to get a shock treatment, they ask some of the more classier patients to help with those, and I had to be one of the classier patients, and so I would help this guy. I'd put a stick in his mouth so he didn't swallow or bite his tongue off. Next day, he'd do it for me. And we became great friends. Problem is, we couldn't remember each other's name. Shock treatments are supposed to help you forget, you know. And I remember the first time I seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I thought, man, that's me. I'm right on, you know. I had my best time in the nut wards of Missouri and the nut wards of the military service. And I never could. I was told by a patient who had been there for a long, long time, she says, you know, if you don't finish that belt, they'll never let you out of here. And I says, I don't want to make a belt. Well, she says, well, try an ashtray. Try a bat, but you got to finish one thing or you'll never get out. And so I forget what it was I finished, but I did finish, and I did finally get out of there. I went back home to my wife and my 3 stepchildren, and I knew that, you know, if we could have a child of our own, things would be different. In my case, everything was going to be different if something else happened. You know, not if I did anything, but if something else happened. So she agreed to do that. But by January the 31st, 1966, when that child was born, I was nowhere to be found. In fact, I was living in a garage, basement garage someplace in downtown Kansas City with not much. I did call my mother on New Year's Day, and she said, "Did you know you had a baby son last night?" I said, "No, I didn't." She says, "Well, you got to go up to the hospital and see him." So that afternoon, I trotsied up to the hospital, and they had just made the announcements that the fathers could go in the closet, put on the green robe and the smock, and they were going to bring the babies down for feeding, and they'd be able to hold their newborns. And as they made that announcement over the PA system, my wife says, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I want to hold our son." She said, "I don't want you to touch him." And I hung the robe back up and walked down the hall, looked through a window and seen him. And 6 months later, I seen him for 5 minutes in a shopping center. But see, I had a full-time job. My job was drinking. And when you drink, it doesn't leave you much of a chance to do child support or try to make arrangements to have a relationship. And Kansas City was becoming too small of a town for me to live in, and I started to make my geographic. I took a job on the road selling, and I ended up in Minneapolis, Minnesota 18 months later. And it's not a very pretty story, and I don't think there's ever been a time I haven't told it. Because, you see, for me, if I was to pick up that drink today, I know I'm capable of doing the very same thing again and again and again and again. Total futility. Because to me, another drink was more important than a human life. More important than a human life. And life went on. I got to Minnesota, and I realized one day that part of my problem was that all the women I'd married were not very smart. And, obviously they weren't very smart or they wouldn't have married me, right? So I met this smart lady from Wayzata. She had $2,000 in the bank, and she was a teaching assistant at the University of Minnesota and was about to become an Edina senior high school teacher. And we started going out, and first thing you know, we got married. I had just turned 29, and here I was married for the third time. She was 24, and I thought, things are going to be different this time. Things were always going to be different. Anybody identify with the things were always going to be different? This time, I'm not going to stay away and drink. I'm going to drink at home. I'd never done that before. And I'd drink 2 or 3 bottles of wine before dinner, and my wife would have a glass or two, but by the time she served it, well, I'd be passed out on the couch. Now, she was 24 and I was 29. I think she was expecting something a little more than that, but I didn't realize that. I thought I was being a good husband by not drinking away from the house. That was the way I justified it. So we separated probably a half a dozen times that first year of marriage. On Mother's Day of 1969, I did not get a hold of that drunken mom of mine. I didn't send her a card or a flower or nothing. But about a week later, she called me on the phone. She says, "I want to tell you something, Charlie." She says, on Mother's Day, I called some people, and they came and see me, and I haven't had a drink since. And I'm going to A&A in Independence, Missouri. I said, "Mom, that's good. I'm glad that you're going to do something about your drinking." My mother was a lousy, horrible drunk. She lived her last 10 years drinking in a total blackout. Not me, of course. I was crazy, and I'd much rather be crazy than be an alcoholic. That was my excuse. We went down to see her in November of that year for Thanksgiving, and she asked me, she said, they're having an open meeting over at the clubhouse, and I want to know if you'll come because I'm chairing it, and you and Nancy can come and hear the speakers. And I thought, my God, she's only been in AA about 9 or 10 months. She already owns it, chairing a meeting. So I went to that meeting that night, and I didn't get much out of it. However, when I was 23 years old, just 7 or 8 years before, I'd been in those same rooms to 2 meetings. Problem was, back then, I was too young to be an alcoholic, and nothing bad had happened to me yet. I didn't get a DWI, I had a lot of reasons why there was no reason for me to go back there, but I ended up back in that same old church basement. It was an Alano club, but it had been an old RLDS church, and they had all these pictures of the carpenter up there knocking on doors and opening their heart, and just scared the willy jillies out of me. I went back home. We spent Christmas, and this thing kept gnawing at me. And my mom sent me this plaster Paris prayer. My mom was big on plaster Paris. You go into her little family room, and she had all these plaques on the wall, plaster Paris plaques. She made them in some, something, somebody had something going on. She learned how to make them. But this had a funny prayer on it. They called it the Serenity Prayer. And she had written something on the back of it. I didn't pay much attention to it. But she had told me when I was there that if I ever thought that I might have a drinking problem, I could call this person that she knew in downtown St. Paul. Because when she had come up and visited us that previous summer, she called that person and went to a meeting, and they came up and picked her up. Well, it turns out that person was the manager of the local St. Paul intergroup at that time. It was a lady by the name of Paul. So anyway, I had this number, and I go over to the high school that my wife is teaching at. It's on February the 16th, 1970. And I asked my wife in the parking lot of that school if she was coming home that night. She said, well, she'd probably come home that night, but she wasn't sure about any of the other nights. And I was just at the end. I started that drive back to St. Paul out of Edina, and on the freeway, about 35W and Diamond Lake Road, for those of you who are familiar with Minneapolis, I had that moment of clarity that you hear people talk about in meetings. I don't know where it came from. I don't know why I particularly got it that afternoon. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 4. But by the time I got to my apartment in St. Paul, I had made this decision. I was going to call this lady on the slip of paper to learn something about alcoholism. And I went down there, and my wife went with me. My big decision that night is, what do I wear? If I go in a suit and tie, they're going to think that I'm not qualified. If I go looking like a bum, they're going to kick me out. And I didn't quite frankly know what to expect. And I was a sales rep at that time, and I did have a sport coat on, I think. So we went down to that meeting and listened to some guy tell my story. I thought they'd hired for the night. Then afterwards, what they do with the newcomers, they take them back in the coffee room, and there's so many different groups that meet in there, they kind of divide them up among the old-timers. And you don't know that this is going on, of course, but you're all of a sudden getting assigned to a home group. You don't know that. But they introduced me to an old couple by the name of Marty and Mike. They were both old enough to be my parents, and our last drink had been a can of Sterno underneath a bridge in downtown St. Paul. And they were each sober 5 years. And they're the ones that carried the message of hope to me. And they made this statement, and I remember it just like it was this morning. And I'm sure Bob would remember it. And for the guy that got the book, listen very, very closely. One of my great fears before coming here is I heard this, that you had to quit drinking to be a member of AA. And I did not want to do that. My game plan was never to quit. I would not quit. Drinking was the most important thing in my life. That's why it was so much easier for me to be in the nut ward and be crazy than it was to think about quitting drinking. Is because there I could, I knew what I was. But I did not want to quit. But Marty and Mike said this to me. They said, Chuck, one thing about AA is you don't never have to quit. The way we do it is we stop for one day at a time. We stop for, you got to work 8 hours. I had a job. I was about ready to lose it, but I had one. You're going to sleep 8 hours. You got 4 hours to come down to the club to drink some coffee before a meeting starts. You got 4 hours to make up to your wife. The day goes by pretty quick. But you don't have to quit drinking. We just stop for one day at a time. Now, that was over 31 years ago, and I've never quit drinking. I've just stayed stopped. Right, Bob? You just stayed stopped. He's there. And I think that's the hope that we give to new people. Because most of us, when we get here, we don't want to quit drinking. Quitting is not in our vocabulary. So I like that word stop more than quit, because I think quit scares too many people off. But these two people had conned me into coming back the next night. They conned me so bad that by Saturday night, this was a Tuesday night, by Saturday night I was bringing a silly old chocolate cake to their bingo. I didn't have anything in common with these two, you know. Total strangers, they just loved me. I went home that night and I pulled out that plaster parish prayer that my mom had sent me a few months before, and I turned it around to see what the hell it said in the back. And here's what it said. It said, "Son, I hope that someday you find what I have found." And that's as good a prayer as it gets right there. So in reality, I was 12-stepped by a woman. I know most men don't 12-step women. We just don't do that here. But in this case, it was a mother and a son. But she was smart enough to know that if she came down hard on me, that I probably would close off my hearing, which had been closed off for some time. And I wouldn't listen. So she set an example and got sober herself, and I seen a change. And it was wonderful. And I started my journey in Alcoholics Anonymous that day. And I didn't know that this journey would end up being a real journey. It just never occurred to me that anything good in my life would ever happen. I thought that I was at the end of the road. I didn't know I was at the beginning. And a lot of us come here pretty broken up and pretty shameful, and we begin to put our lives together. And sometimes we trudge a little harder. You know, life is life, but for the most part, things started to happen for me. I met my good friend Bob B., who was supposed to be here this tonight. I was 6 months sober, and him and I started hanging out together and doing a lot of stuff. And I realized after about 9 months of sobriety that I didn't crave a drink anymore, and I couldn't believe it. It just wasn't even a thought. That thought had left me. And a year went by, and a couple years went by, and my wife and I were getting along pretty well. Here I was 2 years sober, and I wake up in bed in the morning and find I'm still with the same lady. You know, this is, well, I'll tell you what, I did that this morning. It's still the same one. We've been married 32 years, and that's a miracle in itself. We wanted to have children, of course, because I had been a lousy father. I figured God would probably want to punish me about that, and it was getting to be pretty hard. So we went, my doctor says, I think maybe you need to go to an adoption agency and at least start that process. In the meantime, I'll give you some vitamin shots every Saturday morning. You come down to my office, and because I was the culprit, evidently. And while we were going through that process, and finally got a call to be interviewed for the next step, why my wife discovered that she was pregnant. And on my third AA birthday, we had a son, Jonathan. In fact, I remember that very, very well. It was my third birthday. It was a downtown club, and Bob and Linda and I went out to dinner. I was 3 years sober. We went down. They heard me talk, and my wife was over in the hospital. Had just had the baby the day or two before. And that was the beginning. A couple years later, we had another one. We call him Jeff. Well, we call him that because that's his name, but I don't know why I always say that. And these children were brought up in Alcoholics Anonymous. I heard a baby cry a minute ago, and I was going to say, when I'm talking, babies stay in the room. When I'm talking, children are welcome here. This is not a place where it's not to be seen and not heard. We want to hear your cries and your whimpers, and Mom, can I have another quarter to play the Pac-Man machine down the hall? This is a family disease, and families heal together, and this is, you know, it became normal for my children to go to AA just like it would be to go to Sunday school, Boy Scouts, or PTA, or Sunday, whatever. I mean, it was just a normal part of their life as they're growing up. And I can remember my boys coming home from school telling me about a friend of theirs. Their dad had a real bad drinking problem, and what I call this guy. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, John, why don't you give your friend my phone number, and if he wants to give it to his dad, then his dad can call me. Okay, and once in a while that would happen. When my oldest son was in 7th grade, he went back to his grade school, and what he did was he helped mentally and physically handicapped children in the classroom. And sometimes he went to their funerals. But he learned how to become of service to his fellows by learning what he found in Alcoholics Anonymous. And this is a miracle. I can remember one time we were on a little trip, and Some of you remember Don had Gopher State Tape Library, and boys were in the front seat, and I'd come up to wife number 2, and then wife number 2, wife number 1, and wife number 2, and then Jeff would say, "Is this Mama coming up now, Dad?" You see, I've been pretty open with my children about my alcoholism. They know all about it. They've heard me many times. They've taken my tapes and given it to friends of theirs. Not that I have that many tapes. I'm not famous like some people, but like Bruce. I'm not as famous as Bruce, am I? But this was normal. This is how we operated our life. And, you know, good things started to happen. I was about 8 or 9 years sober, and I got a call from a guy I know. He says, "You know, Chuck," he says, "for your involvement in Alcoholics Anonymous, it's not right that you're a convicted felon. Have you ever thought about changing that?" I said, "Well, I don't know that I can." He says, "Yeah, you can." So they had me apply, members of AA had me apply for a pardon in the state of Iowa, and the governor of the state of Iowa gave me a full pardon. And for anybody in this room that still has that emotional shame from the things that you did in the past, I knew a guy out in California that had 17 felony convictions, and he got a full pardon too. This program changes us on the inside and the outside. It's an inside job. We are totally different people once we're here and we begin to work this program. Totally different. Then I was asked to serve on jury duty in my hometown, and they ask funny questions when they have the prosecutor, the defense attorney. They ask these questions of potential jurors. They have this big pool of jurors. This is a criminal court case. And they started asking these jurors before they got to me, "Do you have any courtroom experience?" And I got to think, I wonder what they're going to ask me when they get to me. And so I was just honest. I said, "Yeah," I said, "I've got some." And then the judge says, "Well, you don't have to answer that if you don't want." I says, "No, that's fine." So the prosecutor, that was the defense attorney, and the prosecutor got up and says, "I have no questions." And the defense attorney says, "Can you give my client a fair trial?" I said, "I believe I can." And we heard a trial for 2.5, 3 days, and then we were excused to go in this jury room, and the peers in my community elected me as their foreman. I became the first convicted felon ever to serve as a jury foreman in the state of Minnesota. Now, you can't tell me that happens outside these walls. It don't. It just doesn't. But you know how sobriety is and how business goes. I started to become fairly successful in business, even though I could barely read or write. It seemed like everybody I talked to wanted to buy something from me that turned into money. And I started taking some of that to my head. And I forgot about the gifts that God had given me through you people. And, big houses and new cars and swimming pools and trips to Europe and do all kinds of fun stuff like that. And I thought what I was doing is I was showing my wife how much I loved her. And as it turned out, why, she didn't love me at all. Because you see, what I discovered is you can't buy love. You have to be able to show it. And I wasn't much good at that, I'll be very frank with you. I knew I loved her, and I could say it. And I could buy things, but I didn't know how to show it. And unbeknownst to me, 20 years of sobriety, she nearly left. And I went into a rut. I went into a tailspin. Bill Wilson talks about emotional sobriety. And I went into a tailspin, and I couldn't get out of it. I did not have emotional sobriety. And eventually I did. Somebody said, "Well, how'd you do that?" I said, "Well, I'll tell you what. I don't tell anybody, but I started working the steps." You see, what happens to some of us is we can take this journey for granted. I did step 4 6 years ago. What do I need to fool with it for now, What do you mean I did something wrong today? I don't need to admit that. I did a step 10 last week. I discovered, for me anyway, I don't know about you, but I can't rest on my laurels. And I opened up a 12 by 12 one day on page 48, and I'm not much of a reader out of the book when I give a talk, but I want to show you what I discovered. The bottom of page 48 in the 12 by 12 in step 4, it says, to avoid falling into confusion over the names these defects should be called, let's take a universally recognized list of major human failings. The 7 deadly sins of pride, greed, lust, anger, gluttony, envy, and sloth. And for me, pride and anger led the way. And I made a unique discovery about myself that I did not know, that I had been an angry person all my life. You know what? I accepted that as just one of my character flaws, that I wasn't going to be able, I didn't need to change that. That was my personality, right? And because I was an angry person and thought it was a part of my makeup, I never looked at that as a real defect. I looked at that as just my personality. You know, when I discovered that anger was a major defect within me, that I really had to work at it. So I made the decision on a one-day-at-a-time basis to work on just anger for one day. Now, does that mean I haven't been angry in the last 11 years? Yeah, I have been a few times. But you know what the difference is today is I recognize it. And I didn't then. I thought I was showing my family love, and I was showing them anger. Because you see, that's how I was loved. Why wouldn't you love the same way back? And I began to rebuild my marriage. My kids were not affected by this. They've been great children. But I started to rebuild my marriage, and I started to rebuild the trust and the love. And I looked at the way I sponsor differently today than I did then as well. And today I feel that I can be a true sponsor to somebody because I can talk about this anger that I've had. And it's been a wonderful gift to be able to do that. We had a housekeeper in those days, and so we fired the housekeeper. My wife and I took on the task of cleaning the house together. That started us doing something together because I had my AA and then she had her bridge friends, you see. But when we started doing this task together, it brought us closer together. And some weeks she vacuums the rugs and I do the bathrooms and the kitchen floor, and other weeks we reverse that. Because I'm always missing something and she's always missing something. But that's one of our big activities on Saturday. Today's Saturday, so I didn't get to participate. But we always make up for it. And I didn't know much about how to participate as a husband. I'd been married 20 years, sober 20 years, but I didn't know how to participate. And today I believe I've been able to do that one day at a time. When I was 19, I was kicked out of the service. And when my son was 19, my youngest son was 19, he was given us an appointment at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Not because of anything I did, but because he had a great mother. My kids, of course, have never seen me take a drink. The son that would go over and help these little children in grade school became my business partner about 2 years ago. And when he walks in a room, he lights up a room. He completely lights it up. And when he got married about 5 years ago, they brought in the world 2 beautiful little granddaughters, Miranda and Abby. And they've never seen me take a drink, and they've been to AA already, too. In 1988, I was elected delegate to the General Service Conference in New York, as some of the people who stood up in this room tonight. And my mother had been suffering from cancer for about 15 years. In the last 8 years of her life, pretty much the old-timers group came and put a meeting on in her bedroom or in her house. And she was having a pretty tough time of it. And I often would wonder, how, you know, the doctor said she had 6 months to live in 1975, and here it is 1988. She's still going, but she's very ill. And she was sober, I think, about 19 years. And I called her on the phone and told her that I was elected delegate at the General Service Conference. She knew what that was about because she had been a GSR. And when I started giving my conference reports after I got back from New York, I would introduce myself as I'm Chuck, I'm an alcoholic and the son of a GSR. And if there's any GSRs in the room, my hats are off to you because you're the lifeblood of our fellowship, as my mom was. I guess that's one of the reasons why I like GSRs, not because I was one, but because my mom was one. And on December the 5th or 6th, something like that, I was at my Three Legacies meeting on Friday night in Eden Prairie, and I got a call from my father saying that your mom's in a coma, and it doesn't look like she's going to go too much longer. You might want to think about coming down the next day or so. And I went home and went to bed, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, I couldn't sleep, got up, packed a few things, and drove on to Kansas City, and she died on Sunday morning. I got there on Saturday afternoon. And on Tuesday, we had the funeral. And there was a few people from her old AA club, a few neighbors. My dad had a couple of friends there, and my brother had a couple of friends there. And there was one young man I'd never seen before, but he looked familiar. So I went up and introduced myself. I said, "What's your name?" He says, "My name is Tom." This was the Tom that I left behind 21 years before. His mother, because she worked for attorneys, her job was always looking the obituaries every day to see what estates they'd have to take care of. And she happened to see that I was a survivor of my mother's death, and she quite frankly told her son, "I think your dad is dead." But when she read that obituary, she knew I was alive. I don't know what kind of courage it takes for a 21-year-old son to show up at a funeral to a grandmother he never knew, to meet a father he didn't think existed. I don't know what kind of courage that takes. I don't know if I'd have that courage. But he had that courage to do that. And that was the start of another journey in my life of becoming a friend with a son that I didn't know. He had been adopted by my ex-wife's husband. He had been adopted when he was like 3 years old, so he had a different last name. And a week after Nancy and I's son Jonathan was married in Minneapolis, I went down to St. Joe, Missouri, and stood up with him and his mother when he got married. Put on a tuxedo and walked down the aisle with my son that I hadn't seen. We've been friends now, I think, for about 12 years, 13 years. I took him up to Kenora, Canada, with me that first year. We met in December, and then the following September, I went up to Kenora. I was the Friday night speaker, and Clancy was Saturday night, and Polly was Sunday morning, and Saturday morning. And Clancy come up to him and said, "How old are you?" He says, "I'm 22. He said, "When I was your age, I was 24. I'd sit there in that hotel room and watch him sleep all night. I couldn't sleep that first night because I'd never been in the same room with him, you know. And he's a nice young man. He doesn't drink. Everything in my life has been healed. I've had ups and downs and slips and slides, but I've never thought once about taking a drink. And it just boils down to a few simple things like continuing to work the steps. In my early days, I was told once you did steps 4 and 5, you didn't never have to do them again. And I don't have any outside opinions on this program, but for me, I'd never tell that to anybody I sponsor. Step 4 is as alive and real to me today as it was when I first came in. Because the longer we're here, the more honest we can become with ourselves, the more real some of the words have meaning to us today. Real meaning. Real meaning. Just about everything in my life has been healed and has been made better. And when it doesn't happen that way, it's because somewhere along the way I messed it up somehow. I just discovered that after 35 years on the road, I'm going to hang her up in a couple of weeks because I'm going into a new career change. And I just found this out last Wednesday morning, but I'm going to become the new manager of our central office in downtown Minneapolis. For those of you that came to our international convention last year, I was the host chair for that event, and to find 3,000 volunteers to make sure you were all greeted, and some of you volunteers were right in the room. I know of some of this group over here at the marathon meeting. And somebody asked me, how could such an event go so smoothly? And nobody would believe me. I got a call from a guy up in Canada who's got 52 years of sobriety. He says, "Now, I know you had problems, but man, you guys did really a good job." And I says, "Well, here's the kicker, Cease. We didn't have any problems. We didn't have one problem. We had no arguments. We had nobody pout off. We had nobody resign. Because you see, it wasn't about us, it was about you. And whenever you can take this program and make it about you instead of us or me or I, whether it be AA, Al-Anon, or Alateen, it just becomes better for all of us, one day at a time. I think I've used up most of my time tonight. I don't know what time I started, and I know when I sit down, I'm going to think of about 20 things I forgot to tell you. But that's okay. I just want to say to the people in this room that if you're thinking about quitting AA because you're getting too busy doing other things, don't. The reason why it's important that I go to my home group every Monday night is I like to see what God's up to next. And if I don't do that, then I'll never have a chance to witness the miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous. And who's to say maybe that's the night that one guy walks in that can only talk to me, you know? Or maybe it's the guy that I need to talk to. That's why we keep coming back. Thank you.